Hey everyone, thanks for joining me here today. I have a nice long lecture for you, and hopefully you can pause it as needed to catch up on notes or whatever else you need to do. I apologize for not being in class today, so I hope you'll forgive me, but you will have a short quiz after this lecture and be listening for some random facts about me in this lecture. Those will be on the quiz. In addition, you will also have a little discussion topic to fill out. Keep in mind, all of this is due before 1 o'clock p.m. today, as you are expected to be watching this video during the class time. So I hope you are utilizing your time wisely. Make sure you have your study guides handy, as they will come in handy for this lecture. So without further ado, let's get going. So one of the big things we need to talk about to start out photography is understanding photography's little nuances, such as exposure, composition, and focus. So that's what we are going to be discussing today. So one of the first things we need to understand, what is the one thing that you absolutely have to have in order to have a picture? The answer is light. Without light, nothing can be seen, so nothing can be captured. If we can't see it, neither can the camera, whether it's film or digital. And yes, there are a lot of cool filters on digital cameras these days that help you to see in the dark, but still, if there's no light, there's nothing that can be recorded. All right? Basic things of how photography works. So one of the things we need to understand is how optics start to work. And back in the days of, the early painters, the Dutch masters, if you will, like that centuries ago, somehow they figured out that if you have a darkened chamber, such as this box here, and you have a simple little hole in it, what happens is the light is transmitted through that hole. And if you remember anything from science, light transmits in a straight line unless something interferes in its path, like a lens, for instance. So in the days of painting where they didn't really have the optics figured out, the light would come in through a simple opening, and because it passes through as a straight line, it would reflect the top of a tree, for instance, upside down. And same thing with the bottom of the tree, it would be flipped up. And painters and artists were able to use this concept, and this is what we call a camera obscura. And it doesn't mean it necessarily has film in it or anything, but it allows us to capture the real life scene in front of us, or in this case, on the other side of the wall or the box. So this is one of the biggest ways that artists started to figure out photography. So one of the other things we need to understand is how we see what we see, and that is through reflected light. All right, so light is bouncing off of every surface, and it is the color of light that is bouncing off that we are seeing. So if you look at this diagram here with the red ladybug, you have the visible spectrum of white light, which are all the Roy G. Biv colors, right? And they're all hitting that ladybug, but it's the red light that reflects off of it and allows us to see that red color. So if we were seeing the green grass, which I know it's been covered by snow lately, but imagine if it were green, it would be the green lights that would be reflecting off of it, allowing us to see the green of the grass. So the lighter the colors, the more reflection. So if you think about winter time, people say to wear dark colors because they absorb the light, and we know light to be warm. And so we want to stay warm in the winter. Whereas the summertime, they say to wear light colors because it reflects the light more to help keep you cooler. Hopefully that all makes sense. All right, so here we go. So one of the things we need to understand about light is that light is not equal. It is not equal from sunlight to flashlight to candlelight. And you guys should be able to notice that just by like, oh yeah, a candlelight doesn't put off nearly as much light as a sun will. So indoor lighting especially can be very deceptive. So even if you've got bright overhead lights that your eyes are thinking, hey, it's plenty bright in here, your camera says, there is not enough light because it cannot compete with the sun. So we'll talk about all of this a little bit more. But one of the biggest things that we need to understand is how to control that light that the camera is getting. And one of the biggest ways we can do that is ISO. And if we talk about ISO in the terms of technical naming, it is International Organization of Standardization. And I know that doesn't make sense, but if you put those words into French, it would be ISO in terms of the acronym. So what is ISO or ISO? I know it looks like an acronym and most people would say ISO, and I did for years, but after watching many videos and controversies, it is pronounced ISO. So what is it? It is a numerical rating that indicates the sensitivity or the speed of a digital sensor or film. And the rating doubles each time the sensitivity doubles. Okay. So ISO ultimately is the film or sensor's sensitivity to light. The sensitivity to light. Okay. So if we look at this graph here, we say less sensitive is at like 50, and that's one of the lowest ISOs you're going to find. So I think there sometimes is 25, but it's not very common. Whereas we get up to 1600, which is a common film speed, which actually even up to 3200 is a common film speed. That is more sensitive. And how does that relate to what you're taking pictures of? Well, on a bright sunny day, like you can see behind me, 50 or 100, if you're photographing outside, should be acceptable because you have a lot of abundant, bright sunlight. So you don't need the film to be super sensitive because light is very easy to find. But as you move indoors, you might need something more like 400, 800, or maybe even higher than 1600 because the light isn't as strong. Our eyes are amazing in the ability to perceive light and adjust the pupil size to allow the amount of light coming in. And we'll talk about how that affects aperture more later. But as we go into darker scenes, we might be in a silly classroom, right? And our eyes think it's plenty bright because we can see just fine. Okay? But the camera disagrees. And it's because of the way our eyes function that we are able to perceive it to be bright enough. But in the camera sense, you're going to need film speed or a digital sensor speed that is more sensitive, meaning the tinier bits of light can still be captured. So if I were to try to use ISO 50 or 100 speed film in our classroom, we would not be able to get a good quality photo because there would not be enough light in that classroom to reach the film or the sensor with enough strength to give us a good image. Okay? It's not to say it's impossible, but it's less possible. So why not use something that makes it easier? So again, if you're going to be inside, you might need ISOs 800 or 1600. Now I mentioned to you guys that I do weddings and portraits, and even in receptions with flashes on, I'm often at ISO 2000 or 2500, especially as you get to the dark nighttime receptions. And it's because of that, my camera says, hey, there's not enough light to give us a good image. Okay. So keep that in mind. And digital cameras nowadays can do a lot better. Your film cameras are going to be limited by the film you put in it. Each roll of film will have an ISO designation. And the most common one is going to be ISO 400, which is what we will be using in this class this semester. Okay? So, again, so the more available light you have, like bright sunlight, the lower your ISO can be. Now, that's not to say you can't use ISO 400 outside. Again, that's what we're going to be using in this class, and we're going to be doing a lot of outdoor shooting, knocking on wood, and weather permitting. So you can absolutely use ISO 400 for outdoors, okay? But the darker your environment gets, the higher your ISO will need to be. So it might need to be bumped up to, 1600 or higher. Now in film, that's going to be harder because it's whole roll of film then you have to have. But you don't need to worry about this. All right. Just need to understand a little bit of concept of what ISO is and how it affects your images. So here's one of the favorite charts that I use to really kind of explain what ISOs are going to be good for what. Now, again, I said I'm right in this range of between 1600 and 3200 at wedding receptions, even with extra flashes going off in the room to help add light to the scene. And that's some of my personal preference. I know photographers that will use ISO 800 with flashes, and it just creates a darker background, which is not my style. Okay, so by no means are these set in stone and required to use in certain situations. You do you. But again, so the brighter the sunlight, the lower your ISO can be, but the darker it gets, the higher the ISO will be. Okay. All right. So if ISO helps to control how much light the film or the sensor can handle and needs to create an image, what would exposure be? Exposure is actually a two-part process. It is not only the act of allowing the light to strike a light-sensitive surface, such as your film or your sensor, but it's also the amount of light hitting that surface. And again, it's going to be controlled by the aperture and shutter speed. And we'll talk more about that in the next few lectures. ISO is one part of what we call the exposure triangle. And if you know anything about geometry, it's a three-sided thing. And one side is exposure or ISO, one side is aperture, and one side is shutter speed. And they adjust so that everything stays balanced. And we'll talk about that as we go. Don't worry about it right now. All right, so one of the things we need to do is we need to understand how to measure the light. And even in the film cameras, most film cameras should have a decent enough light meter. And inside that light meter, it's registering the amount of reflected light entering that lens or entering that camera. Again, if we're using an SLR camera, which is a single lens reflex, it means there is a mirror on the back side in the camera that sits at a 45-degree angle. And it is allowing the light to come in to hit that mirror, and it's bouncing up into the pentaprism. And inside of all of that is a sensor registering how much light is coming in. And what it's trying to do is it's trying to balance the brightest light and the darkest light coming in so that you get what is called a middle gray or 50% brightness. All right, that's its job, is it's trying to balance and figure out the best base exposure for us. Okay, so in other words, if I were to show it this picture or this scene of these pretty pink orchids, the camera doesn't care about the color. It's going about the amount of reflected light. And so to get that perfect exposure, it changes it into a 50% gray. Okay. Now, you won't have so many of these metering modes on film cameras, but you will have them if you go into digital cameras, not necessarily your phones. Some of them may have something if you're in like a pro camera app, but chances are probably not. All right. So if we were on a digital SLR or a mirrorless camera with manual modes, you might see some different metering options such as spot metering, center weighted, evaluative matrix, or 3D. Different brands will call it different things, and it essentially that bottom one means it's taking all of the light coming into the scene and smushing it together like the painter's palette and saying, here you go, here's your middle gray. Okay, so spot metering is like what it says, and in digital you get to choose where in that frame you are going to say, hey, I want the light meter to focus here for a good exposure. Center weighted means everything is taken directly in the center. It doesn't matter if your focal point's here or down below or anywhere else but center. Okay. Center weighted is not typically used and a lot of photography because, as you're going to learn in this lecture, centered images are not a good thing, typically. Not saying it's impossible, but we'll talk about that later. So most of the time, what I am doing is I'm using spot metering because I tend to do a lot of people and portraits. I need to know that skin tones are correctly exposed, whether or not they are backlit, meaning there's a bright source of light behind them, or if they've got front lighting. I don't want people to be under or overexposed, so I use my spot metering to get the exposure on skin tones. Okay, so again, spot metering is good for subjects, like I said, that might be backlit or front lit and it's constantly changing. Center weighted is if you've got something directly in the center, but again, it's not commonly used. Unfortunately, if you have any sort of, uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Autofocus. Thank you. If you have any sort of autofocus in your camera, it is going to assume that your exposure and focus is going to be the center of the image. And that's just very common on film cameras. Now, if you have an older model camera like mine, I have a Pentax K1000. It's an old beast, and if you can find them, I highly recommend them because of their durability. But even if it's manual focus, the center is where the light source is going to be predominantly focused for metering light, but it's still taking in all the light coming in, period. Okay. Back in film days with those cameras, the technology wasn't as sophisticated to say, oh, well, you can change it to here. That's not how that worked in film days. Okay. So in a sense, film cameras are center weighted in the sense that their focus is in the middle, but it's taking in all of the light as an evaluative metering. Okay. So if you're newer to photography and you're not confident with moving around your different cursors for spot metering, then absolutely stay with the evaluative matrix metering in your cameras. And that's, again, more applicable to digital cameras than it will be for film. Okay. So here's what some of those icons may look like. And each brand, each model is going to look slightly differently, but this is generally a fairly uniform type look, especially for spot metering. Center weighted mean it's got those little brackets around the center, like it can't go anywhere. It's like a little cage. And then you have evaluated where it shows everything is being evaluated. Okay. And here's what the camera kind of does in those different modes. So evaluative, yes, this one I know it's kind of in the middle or off to the side here. And you can choose the focal points on digital cameras. So it's still, you're saying, here's my focal point, but you're going to take in the light from all over the scene and you're going to focus it here and it branches out. Spot metering, I know this one's in the center, but imagine this spot were up here on the right-hand side. It doesn't matter where it is, that spot is where the metering will happen. I don't know what this partial one is, but I haven't had a good graphic that shows it without, so I'm sorry. And then center weighted average means it's going to be centered no matter what, and it's going to fan out. Sometimes it will include all of the lighting, but it's going to place heavy emphasis in the middle. Okay. Now we might have some type of light metering problems when we are trying to take our pictures. And some of those might be backlit images. So backlit means you have a lot of bright light coming in from behind you. So kind of in this video, if you look at my screen of me, you'll see that I've got bright light from the windows behind me. That is very common for backlight. And if you're looking at some of the brighter, lighter and airier styles is what they call it, this is typically the lighting they'll use where they'll have the light behind the subject, which is again another reason for getting good exposure on the faces because they fall into shadow then. Another one is a dark scene with bright spots of light. So imagine you've got a nice sunny summer day and you're standing underneath a tree with a lot of leaves and you've got spots of the sun dappling through. So you get the spotted look on your face and your shoulders. That is a dark scene with bright spots of light. And it's because there's such a stark contrast between the dark shadows and the bright sunlight that your camera says, hey, I don't know what to do. Okay, I might give you the correct exposure, I might not. Okay. Another one might be a brighter scene, such as a beach or the lovely snow that we've had. How many of you have ever been outside in the snow and you're just like, oh, especially after it's gotten sunny, and you're just like, oh man, it is blinding. Again, remember your camera is trying to say, hey, I need 50% gray, and that white, that's not 50%. So it's going to see that beach and it's going to darken it down. Beach, I say beach, but snow. Beaches do the same thing because if you've ever seen sand, it tends to glisten. So it has a high reflectance value. And again, that camera's like, whoa, I need some sunglasses, okay? And then the other option that might cause problems is a properly lit foreground with a darker background. Case in point, turn on the flash on your camera in a dark scene. Maybe you're at a party or a club and you've turned on that flash to illuminate your friends. Okay, your camera may or may not be able to light you correctly, and it might not get the background light the way you're hoping because it says, well, this is supposed to be correctly exposed. The background gets sacrificed. Okay, so oftentimes, especially when you have either really dark backgrounds or really bright backgrounds, sometimes you have to decide, hey, what's more important, the foreground of your subject or the background? Now, if you're going for a silhouette, then obviously the background. But if you're not, then it's probably the foreground if you're doing a people shot. Okay, so let me show you some examples that kind of illustrate this rather than just hearing my words. So here's an example of backlit. And you notice the bright sunlight behind them here. And I didn't want their skin tones to look too dark. That's not how they really look. And again, I'm a people person. And when you take photos of people, and you give them to the people, they don't want to look weird. They don't want to look like dark skinned people or, maybe overly sunburned or like they bathed in sunless tanner and turned orange. You want to make sure you give them correct skin tones. So by brightening up this image, then I get my skin tones where they need to be. And the background is going to also brighten. Okay. So here's a nice scene where I said, you remember those sunny day and you have those trees with all the bright spots? That's another example. Now, my editing is a little different, so I can lighten the shadows, but without brightening up the highlights so much, and I'll talk about what those terms mean. So it gives it a better balance. But again, your camera might still be like, hey, I don't know what you want to do. I'm going to kind of guess and throw a dart at it. But this is what might happen. Okay. So bright scenes with high reflectance. So this is my daughter from our time in Plattsburgh. We lived up there for about 11 years. She's now about to turn 13. Holy crap. She was probably 7 or 8 during this photo. But anyways, if you look at the snow, we all know snow falls and it's white, right? But our camera's like, hey, it's too bright. I need sunglasses. So it tries to darken it down and make it look like it put on sunglasses. It darkens it down to that 50% gray. And in order for us to fix that, we have to raise that exposure so that our white snow looks white again, not dingy gray like it's been gross from the streets. All right. And then finally, a properly lit foreground and a darker background. So in this case, I had a flash off this left-hand side from here, and I was angling towards my couple. And this was the June 11th, 2022, I think, tornadoes. So this is before the tornadoes started coming through, but there's the front of all of that drama that came through. But in order to get a good exposure on them, I had to focus on that. That was my priority. And I used my Photoshop and Lightroom apps to help brighten up the background without brightening them up. And if you ever take my digital class, which will be offered at the same time and place next year, so both fall and spring semesters, we'll get into how to edit photos in digital. So, but anyways, lighting is very critical in your photos, and how your camera sees it will greatly affect its exposure and how it is captured. All right. All right. So if exposure is about metering the amount of light and gauging how much is coming in, then what would exposure compensation be? If you think about the two words individually and like their individual definitions, we know what exposure means. Compensation refers to something that is either added or taken away to balance things out. So in this case, it is a manual override of the camera's internal exposure metering. And you're probably thinking, what? It's basically a setting on your camera that tells it, I know what you said is a good exposure, but it's not right for me. So imagine like my beach scene or my snow scene. I'm going to tell the camera, I know what you say, but I know that snow should be white, so I'm going to make you brighter. I'm going to turn your exposure compensation up. I'm going to make it brighter, okay? So if you ever see on your cameras, whether it's on a film or digital even, you might see something that says EV, and it stands for exposure value, and that is where you find your exposure compensation controls. Excuse me. Okay. So if you have a digital camera, you're going to see a little button somewhere that has this little plus minus symbol. And you'd have to look into your camera as to how to utilize it. But essentially, you can push that button, turn a dial, and you can tell it to make things brighter or darker when it captures the scene that you're trying to photograph. Okay. Now, I highly recommend trying whole stops. So if you're on a digital camera, you might have 0.3 or 0.7 as little intervals. And those are what we call third stops. And again, I would rather have you try full stops. They're going to be easier to correlate with film and shutter speeds and apertures. So if you're looking at your camera, you might want to try +1 or -2. All right, so if you're going to the minus side, you're making it darker. You're taking away light. Whereas the plus side is you're making it brighter by adding light. So hopefully this is making a little bit of sense. I know it's still early. We'll get you, I promise. So again, here's another backlit image. Now, I could have left it and I could have said I wanted the sky and the silhouette, but this was about the bride, not the scene. So I went ahead and lit it back up and I used my exposure compensation. Obviously, this was done in post-production, but you can do this in your camera as well before you take the picture. So in this case, this one needed an exposure value of 1.5. And when you get into editing and digital, you'll understand that a little bit more. Just know that it needed to be brighter. Now, if you notice too, backlit scenes especially, again, I talked about this a little bit ago, if you are photographing something that is backlit, in order to get them in good exposure in foreground, because of that, they're falling into shadow, you're usually going to have to sacrifice the background, all right? Now, digital stuff makes it a lot easier to keep the good background, like the sky, for instance, without having to sacrifice the good exposure on your subject, okay? Film is going to be a little bit harder, but we're going to teach you some tricks so that we can get as much information on your film as possible to work with in the darkroom, okay? So another one might be, maybe I accidentally didn't catch my settings because I was changing angles enough when I was photographing this couple and it ended up being overexposed. I wasn't paying attention because things were just kind of happening. And so it ended up being a little bit overexposed. But by taking my exposure compensation down, in this case by 1 stop, it put it back where it needed to be. Okay? So sometimes these things will happen, but this is where exposure compensation can really, really help you. Again, there's that lovely snow. Our cameras are like, no, I don't like snow. It's too bright. So it puts those sunglasses on and it darkens it down. And I have to tell the camera, nope, I'm going to add one stop of brightness because you're too dark. I want my snow to be white. Okay. That's not to say that the one on the left doesn't look fairly accurate on a cloudy and snowy day, but that's not how it should look real life because we know snow is white. Okay. So again, here's that beach scene that I was talking about with the reflectance of the sand, and that sand really has a glistening surface, so it's going to bounce the sun off of the sand and tell your camera, hey, it's too bright, put those sunglasses on. And that's what it did here. So by brightening it up by one stop, it's looking a lot better. Apologies for my coughing here. Gotta love the winter weather. Okay, now, again, most of you will not have these types of modes on your film cameras. Some of them do. Depends on how new of a model it is, okay? And this is another reason why I say to bring all of your camera manuals with you, whether it's in a digital format on your phone or tablet or whatever, or a paper copy if you're lucky enough to find that. Every camera model is different as to what offerings it has for settings and where they are done and how they are adjusted and all of that, okay? So again, most of you won't have these settings, but I do want you guys to be aware of them, especially if you do go into digital photography. So the first one is P, or program mode, or flexible program. And think of your auto mode on your cameras. So if you've ever seen a camera and you've got like the green camera icon, that's usually in auto mode. It does everything for you except push the shutter, right? You get your scene fixed, you have it on auto, and you take a picture and it's done. Okay, program is similar to that in that it's going to tell you, hey, here's what I think your exposure combination should be for your shutter speed and your aperture based on your ISO. Remember, those three things are in that triangle and they work together. Okay, so this can be a great way to start understanding how exposure works, because a lot of times if you're in a program mode, it'll say, here's your shutter combination. And if you turn a dial or a knob or something, usually you can cycle through and you can either change your shutter speed or aperture, and it will adjust where it needs to be to keep everything balanced for that good exposure. So it's a good way to start seeing what things will do to your images. Okay. The next one is A or AV, which is aperture priority mode. So I know Canon uses AV, and I can't remember what other brands use besides Canon. I know Nikon uses A, and most of them I think do. But AV just stands for aperture variable, okay? Ultimately, it means you are choosing the aperture you are going to use for your photos. So whether you want f2.8 or f22, you do that. You choose that. And then the camera says, okay, based on that aperture, here's the shutter speed you need, okay? And your ISO is always going to be set before that, whether it's film or digital. Now, as you get to the smaller apertures, and we'll explain this in another lecture, it might need a slower shutter speed in order to account for the smaller amount of light coming in. And those slower shutter speeds then can lead to blurry images or camera shake. And again, we'll explain that more when we do our motion lecture. Okay? So just get an idea of this for right now. The next one is going to be the opposite of aperture priority, and it's going to be shutter priority. So most cameras use S, but again, I know Canon uses TV, and in this case, it stands for time variable. Same thing in terms of what it does. This time, you get to choose your shutter speed. So if you are doing something like sports photography, you need a fast shutter speed so that you can capture those players in fast motion, but make it look like they are frozen. So like all the photos you see of the Chiefs and how they are mid-action, you know, like if somebody's getting smashed in the face, that is going to be from a fast shutter speed. And by choosing shutter priority, you're saying, I need to make sure my photos are crisp with with the fast shutter speed so I can get that frozen motion. And your camera is going to adjust to the aperture that it needs. Now, I don't like shutter priority very much because you are limited to the lens's apertures that it has, which means you may not have the range available in your apertures to get proper exposure. Okay. So, and if that happens, generally you'll see some sort of warning in your camera, whether the needle, if for film cameras, maybe your needle is going all the way down because there's not enough light. But if you're on something that's a little bit more digital, it might say high or low, meaning that it's too much light or too little light and you can't get a good exposure with that shutter speed. Okay. And sometimes the camera will or will not take, so just be aware of that. But things like fireworks are a slower shutter speed. I typically did those fireworks in Plattsburgh with about 3-second exposures for what it's worth. And there's my middle daughter, Maggie, playing in the sprinkler, and that's a fast shutter speed because I caught her midair. She didn't stand there and pose for me. Do you think a kid's going to do that? You're crazy if you think so. Anyhow, all right. So the final one is manual mode. Now, most of you using film cameras are probably going to have manual mode, and that's the only mode because it's all manual. There is no digital anything to it. So for example, my Pentax K1000 that I told you about earlier, there is nothing automatic about it except for maybe the light meter where it's telling me, hey, too light or too dark on your metering. Okay. So manual mode is very common on film SLRs. If you're using something more like a digital SLR or a mirrorless that is not compact, and we'll talk about that later, or I guess that's more my digital class. Unless you're using a camera like that, you're not going to have these modes, so it doesn't matter. All right, manual mode or manual cameras, you change everything. You choose the ISO, whether it's through your film or your digital sensor or digital camera. You are choosing your aperture. You are choosing your shutter speed. You're choosing it all, okay? And because you have control over every aspect of your settings, you are going to have way more creative control than you would in any other manual mode. Even more so than aperture or shutter priority. All right. So there you go. Now, if you have digital cameras, sometimes you might see some icons that look like what you're seeing here. And again, there's that auto mode. So even if it doesn't say auto, imagine that camera icon as like a green. That's what's most common. That means it's auto mode. All right. Sometimes you're going to have this one with a little lightning bolt, which stands for flash. And it's saying the circle, the no symbol says no flash. So think about things like if you're going into a museum where flash photography is not allowed, you would want this flash off mode to be turned on. Okay. Portrait mode says, hey, I recognize you're trying to take pictures of people. Let me focus on them for exposure. Okay. They know skin tones are going to be a priority. So that's what they're going to focus on. Whereas the opposite is landscape mode. All right. So it's going to be trying to get you a good balanced exposure for a landscape. Okay. Child mode I've not seen before, but again, that one and sports mode generally are going to be focused on faster shutter speeds. Because I don't know if you know anything about kids, but they tend to be fast. They don't like to sit still very often, especially when they're younger. So having those fast shutter speeds is very helpful. Close-up mode, this is another word for close-up, is macro. And that's where you get the really close-up shots that make it look huge. So imagine your bug shots, and I think they're absolutely gross. But your bugs, your centers of your flowers, those are going to be usually macro mode, okay? And then you've got night portrait, which is where it's typically going to use flash so that it can expose your person correctly. And then, of course, you have your manual modes that we just talked about. So anyhow, there you go. All right. So in terms of exposure. That is the gist of it. All right. Remember, it's a two-step process of the light hitting the camera or camera's film or sensor, but it's also the amount of light coming in. All right. So we want to move on to some composition stuff here. All right. So this is part 2 of our lovely lecture. So composition, if you're talking about a fine arts definition, we're talking the organization or grouping of the different parts of a work of art so as to achieve a unified whole. Basically, utilizing different techniques and elements to make it look good. That's what we're talking about. So there are a bunch of things. I've reduced it down to 6 basic elements or tools that artists have used over the centuries to make good composition. So here we go. Some of those are color, light, shape or form, texture, line, and space. And we're going to talk about each one individually and how it relates to photography. So here we go. So colors. Sometimes you're going to see bright colors. Sometimes they're going to be dark colors. Sometimes going to be maybe pastel. Maybe they're kind of a mix of everything. All right. Different colors will have different impacts on our images, both in how we perceive them and how it is recorded and how it works together. Okay. So if you remember anything from your days of art education, you hopefully remember this lovely color wheel here. You remember our red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purples, all that. All right. So we're going to talk about our primary and secondary and tertiary. Now, I don't really want you worried about your tertiary colors so much, but do understand what it means to be primary and a secondary color. All right. So if we're talking about primary colors, we are talking about red, yellow, and blue. They are colors that cannot be created by mixing 2 other colors together. That's why they're primary. Okay. Now, if we were to take different percentages of each of those primaries, or at least 2 of them, that's where we get our secondary colors. So if we take equal parts red and yellow, we get orange. If we take yellow and blue, we get green. And if we take red and blue, we get purple. That's our secondary colors. And it's good to know where these secondary colors play into photography. Okay, so as we start talking about things a little bit more, it'll make a little bit more sense. And especially in the digital class, it'll make sense. All right. So again, if we're talking about tertiary, we're talking about taking 2 parts of one primary and 1 part of another primary, and we're getting this tertiary. So if we have more red than yellow, we're going to get this more reddish orange versus the yellowish orange. Okay. And it's just good to know kind of how this all works together, because it does make a difference, especially in digital photography. Now, for you guys in film, when we're talking black and white, it ain't going to do much to you. It's not going to help you a whole lot, but still good to know. All right. The next one we want to talk about for elements to help with our composition is light. And again, remember, if we don't have light, we don't have photography. We don't have pictures. Because remember, the word photography means painting with light. All right. So we want to think about where the light is. What color is the light? Is it a strong light source or is it a weak one? What kind of shadows does that create? All right. Probably haven't thought this much about light in ever, unless you've done photography class before. So here's what we're talking about. Color light varies from time of day. So the photo on the left was taken mid-afternoon on a nice summer day. And so it looks pretty natural, right? That's what we call good white balance. And midday sunlight typically has a neutral color cast, meaning white would look white if it was under that lighting. Versus early evening, so this would have been, I think this was a cloudy day where this photo was taken, but it was after sunset and you get that blue hour, right? You've heard of golden hour. Blue hour is after sunset. And it's where the sky takes on a bluish tinge before becoming fully dark. Okay. So We need to pay attention to the color of light because that will change the mood of our image. I mean, try to imagine the scene here on the right that was taken in the early evenings with this mid-afternoon daylight. It would not have come out the same way. It would have changed it completely, and I probably wouldn't like it. All right. So again, think about this one. So here's my three daughters. This is Katie, Maggie, and Alex. And Maggie's 11. Alex is about, it just turned 9 by the time you guys watch this. And Katie will be 13 in the following week after watching this. But anyways, the light that we have changes the mood and everything. If we're outside and you can tell they've been playing in the sprinkler, then we absolutely expect bright sunlight. Okay? We expect that bright, and notice the harsh shadows. This is what we call direct lighting, and we'll talk about direct lighting more with your second project. Okay? Whoops. So anyways, there's that direct light versus the soft light. So there's a younger version of Maggie. So we have some soft window light coming in from the side of her face, and it's creating these soft shadows, meaning you can't cut into them and cut the shadow lines away. All right. Then we've got the bouquet here where it's taken on a cloudy day and light is just everywhere. So you get all the details lit from all angles. All right. And then you have something simple like this where you've got just the candlelight and it has such a more romantic feel and a more emotional tie to it versus the bright sunlight, for instance. So light will make a huge difference in how things are portrayed by the viewers. And then again, this is kind of what we call a directional diffuse light here with my three daughters. This was during COVID. And so we have soft shadows, but we have light coming from kind of up above from them. Okay. So you want to pay attention to what light source direction you have coming on, the strength of it, the color of it, because this is a totally different color than this and here. Okay. So think about where the shadows are playing, if there are shadows. If you notice, there's not really any shadows here because it's diffused lighting, meaning light is just there. You can't really say, oh, the sun is up here in the right-hand corner. No, you can't. You don't know where it is. It's just there. Okay. So pay attention to where the lighting is. It will greatly impact your photos. So again, pay attention to the lighting and how something like cloudy days can be really cool, especially in black and white photography, because any light that hits the film is going to be recorded. But if you don't have a good enough exposure to get light even in the shadows, you're not going to be able to get as many details. Okay. So cloudy days are going to be different from afternoon, which are going to be different from sunset, which are different from night. All right. But light will change how each image feels. Okay. All right. So the next aspect we want to talk about is shape or form. Now you can think of it in terms of geometric shapes. So your standard ones that you learn in preschool, your squares, your rectangles, your circles, right? Or we can talk about freeform or organic. And utilizing these different shapes can help create your compositions and get a good composition. All right, so what we're talking about here. So this is kind of more of a combination of freeform as well as circles. So I mean, if you notice, if you think of each little flower as an ellipse or a circle, but as a whole, it's kind of a freeform flow. All right, so we got these kind of curves and arcs here with the clouds. All right, if you look at my family on the beach, they kind of form a pentagon even, right? So there's the floor, the sides of the house, roof, all right? So you got all sorts of geometric shapes here. And believe it or not, this lovely little seagull here is kind of a triangle, all right? If you think about it, the angle of his back with his head, down and across. And you got a nice little triangle, okay? All right, so figuring out how those shapes work can also be a very good tool for you, all right? Texture is the next thing. Now, texture is one of my favorite things to photograph in black and white because you can really make it look gritty or just really play with the feel of it. And the key thing with texture is can you feel the texture when you look at that image? In other words, if you're looking at tree bark, does it look rough and gritty? Does it look like you're going to get a splinter? Or does it look smooth? And if it looks smooth and it's supposed to be rough tree bark, then it's kind of a mismatch. So we might want to rethink something. Are you simulating something with the textures, in the way you're photographing it? Um, are you building up layers to create a different texture? And then also, how does light reflect off the texture? And one of the things I wish I could show you right now is usually at this point, I whip out my phone flashlight. Yes, my flashlight on my camera during this portion of the lecture in our classroom. And I look down at the floor, and it's just this nasty, standard, boring, universal carpeting, right? It has no distinctive features other than blah. And with the light overhead, to look at it, you don't really see or feel the texture. You see more of the color, right? But if you take that flashlight and you put it right on the ground and you angle the flashlight this way, you're going to start to see all the little lumps and divots of the carpeting that you wouldn't have otherwise seen. And that is where the texture becomes more prevalent by changing the angle of the light. Okay? So, some examples of what this is, what I'm talking about. Again, there's that lovely tree bark. And it's because you've got lighting, the way your angle of the camera sit at, as well as the lighting, it helps to emphasize the textures that you are trying to photograph. Okay? Versus this one. This is a metal railing down on the plaza. And it's all the colored reflections from the lighting and whatever else is reflecting light that you see on here. So it's kind of got that smooth texture, but yet you can look at it and feel the grooves of it. And this one is actually a buildup of layers. So if you have ever been to Loose Park, there is a little area where you can kind of walk on some big paver stones across a little bit of water. And this was taken in between those two blocks. So I think this one is like the edge of the water, and then this is one of the pavers. And the texture comes from not only the individual concrete parts here, but also the leaves reflecting in the water in between. Okay? So use those textures and the lighting to help emphasize what you're photographing. Okay? So here's some other ones. So it doesn't always have to be a very rough texture that we're trying to photograph. Maybe you're trying to photograph something a little less rough. I mean, I wouldn't expect this delicate tulip to all of a sudden look rough and gritty. And if it did, then, oh, that's probably not great. Unless that's what you're going for, cool. But that's generally not what I would want to do for that. This is another one of my favorites. This was taken off the plaza too. There's a little fountain somewhere. I can never remember where, so don't ask me. But the bottom of the little fountain has a mosaic in the bottom, and there's a little faucet that drips water, and these are the water droplets hitting the surface, creating ripples. This is off the plaza as well. Yes, I've done a lot of photos on the plaza. Get over it. My guinea pigs, Penny and Hazel, don't care at all, so that's all you need to know. So this is part of a cement structure. All right. But it's a nice symmetrical pattern, which is another thing we'll talk about here in a minute with composition. And then, of course, you've got your pretty flowers and your wedding engagement rings and the shoes and everything. So you've got a variety of textures right there. All right. So the idea is to utilize your lighting and your colors and all the other aspects that you can to create an image that looks like what you're trying to photograph. Okay. Okay. Next one are lines. So we want to talk about how thick are those lines? Where are they? Are they long? Are they short? Are they straight? Are they curved? are they kind of a wiggly combination. All right. Lines are going to be a great tool to use in your photos as well. So here's what we're talking about. All right. So this one is pretty obvious, at least to me, but I'm focusing on these lines. So they're kind of curved, kind of straight. They're kind of organic, right? I mean, it's a tree, which is organic. Um, but utilizing those different lines, and notice I'm using the lighting as well to emphasize my image. Here's a dusty park bench at Loose Park. All right, I'm using the lines to guide my eyes through the image. Okay, versus here, this is Brush Creek from several years ago, and it was frozen over, and I'm using the lines of the river, the light creek bank. That's what we're talking about, to guide me through, and I just want to keep looking down to see where it goes. Okay. The fountain here, we've got several areas. We've got anywhere from here for the curves, but we also have the lines created by the dropping water. We've also got this rim here from the bowl. Okay. And then, of course, we have these nice diagonals along with the arches on the rooftop. All right. So we have a lot of variety in lines, but using those lines to say, go to the spot. Here's where I want you to look. That's where lines can really help you. All right. All right. The last one we want to talk about is space in art. And you'll hear it, sometimes you hear, oh, there's not enough negative space, or there's too much negative space. You're probably thinking, oh, what are they talking about? What we are talking about is positive space is any space in the image that is occupied by your subject. That doesn't mean there's a blank background behind them. Wherever your subject is the positive space. Anything else is negative space. Okay? So it's the area around your subject. Okay? So we want to make sure we understand how our subject fits into the space. Are they your surrounding objects that help with perspective? Are they super close, or are they super far away? And then how does your subject relate to the space it's in? Does it make sense, or is it a juxtaposition? That's for you to decide. Okay? All right. So if we're talking about space, we're talking about using these lines. So I'm looking from front to back. So notice I've got leading lines here. I've got leading down the pier, both at the bottom and the top. I'm also using my lighting and my colors to guide where I want to look. And in this case, I want to focus right here on these waves crashing underneath the Huntington Beach pier. Okay. So this was taken on one of our many trips out there. And fun fact, my husband and I got married in California at Firestone Winery many years ago. Not that old, but plenty old. So here's my daughter. She's sitting, this was actually taken in my old front yard in Plattsburgh, and she is blowing a dandelion, much to my dismay. Because if you know anything about gardening and yard keeping as an adult, you don't want dandelions. They are horrible. But I wanted the fun action shot of her blowing the dandelions. So she's sitting where you can see a bunch of dandelions popped up in our yard. All right. We got the lovely seagull. He makes sense to be on a beach. It would be weird to see him in my grass, right? Seagulls don't go in the grass. So he's relating to his scene. Maybe your scene isn't really have a specific subject. Maybe the scene is the subject. All right. So if we were talking about this landscape, it really doesn't have a whole lot of positive versus negative. I mean, I would say maybe this is more positive than negative, but to me, it's kind of all just there. Versus my daughter and the bird here, that's going to be my positive space, and the background surrounding them is going to be your negative space. Okay. So again, there's those lovely flowers, and we expect to see those in a group of flower beds, right? They were wildflowers in Colorado, I believe. And then we got this lovely creek, so we're using the colors and the shapes. So there's like a line here, kind of an S shape, where you're looking through the creek. We've got different colors between greens and blues to kind of guide us through, as well as a little bit of the lighting. So we're using a multitude of elements to create a single good image. All right. So one of the other things we need to talk about is point of interest. And think of this as, where do you want your audience to look? All right. Where's your focal point? Where's your subject? All right. So the things that you can use are all those things we just talked about. So your color, your leading lines, your shapes, your frames, your tones, all those different things. And notice I have in there frames. We really didn't talk about frames, but we'll get there. All right. So when we're talking about our point of interest, we're talking about the focus. So you want to think about, where is your focus? The most common practice is to do closest subject or closest to the camera. It may or may not be your subject, but that is the most common, okay? Now, depending on what you're going for, you may not want that. So in other words, if I'm photographing at a wedding reception and I'm photographing my couple a ways away, but they've got a bunch of people around them, I don't want to focus on the people, the back of the heads of the people closest to me. I want to focus on my couple further away. So I might want to do the not do the closest subject for pictures. Now, where does your camera focus? That's where you need to check your camera manual. Now, if you are using a film SLR camera with no manual bells and whistles or no auto functions, you don't have to worry about it. Your focus is where you tell it, okay? Plain and simple. You focus it on the ring on your camera, and where it's focused is where you did it, okay? Film cameras that do have autofocus abilities are going to focus in the center. It is very uncommon for film cameras to have the points that you can move around. So it will focus in the center. And sometimes when it comes to that, I would rather just put it in manual mode, but that's up to you. You can focus in the center, but then I'm going to ask you to recompose your image so that your composition is better. Because again, centered is not always a good thing. And we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. All right. So again, look at your camera manual to figure out where your camera might be focusing if it does have autofocus options. Okay. So the first thing we need to learn are the 10 rules of composition. Okay. And when I talk about rules, you'll understand. So the first one is the most common one, and it is called the rule of thirds. It essentially means taking your scene or what's in the viewfinder and breaking it down into a grid of 3 by 3. So 3 across and 3 vertically, okay? And the idea is that you're ultimately avoiding the middle. It's the dead zone. And I say the dead zone, and it's not that it can't be used. It takes a lot of strong elements for it to work successfully, okay? And you're probably thinking, well, that's exactly where I put everybody's faces when I'm taking photos on my phone. And I'm going to tell you right now, I'm sure you do. The goal of this class is to get you to stop doing that. Because the funny thing is about composition, our eyes, when we are trying to take a picture, we want to inherently put everybody's face in the middle of the image. But our brain and our eyes are like, no, I don't want to look in the middle. I want to look closer to the edges. And that's where we generally want to put our subject, away from the middle where our eyes want to put it for composing. It seems so backwards, right? But that's how it is. So if we are talking about portraits, generally we want to focus on the eyes and getting them at or above that upper third line. All right. So again, whether it's a vertical or a horizontal composition or landscape, as we call it, the idea is to get those eyes above that upper third line. Okay. So here's my daughter, Alex. Got her, even though she's seated, I've got her eyes above that upper third line. And again, it's inherent that we try to put faces in the middle portion of the frame. So right through this middle box here. and generally even more so right in that dead zone. All right. But if you actively try to cut off the top of people's heads with the viewfinder, your compositions will greatly improve, especially with people. Okay. So that is your goal as we do portraiture, and that will be a very big priority in your second assignment with the light versus dark. Okay. The other thing with portraiture is you need to give people or any other object that has some sort of face, even if it's a bug, a statue, a stuffed animal, if it has something that you feel should be looking somewhere, give it space to look. So what I mean by that is, if you notice my bride here, she's on the right hand side of the image, but her eyes are going to the left. So she's got more space in front of where she'd be looking than behind. So even here with my daughter, she has her eyes kind of in the front, but imagine if her eyes were looking over to her right or our left. I would want to put her face then further to the right, so she has more space in front of her to look than behind. And the reason is, when we don't have that space, it looks a little odd and it can get a little off-putting. Okay. All right. So if we are talking about the rule of thirds with landscapes, generally the horizon line falls at or above, on the extremes around those third lines, generally avoiding the middle. So if you look at these images here, at least one of them you've seen before. You've seen this pier one. Notice my horizon line is right on that lower third. But the leading lines that we've got here, along with all the colors and the lighting, help guide our eyes. And it's weird because it guides us to the middle. It's like, what's beyond there? All right. Versus this one here, this was taken at Smithville Lake. So my horizon line is actually up here. Notice it's on the upper third, and that's because I've got some interesting foreground detail that I wanted to include, okay? Versus this one that was taken down in Key West a few years ago. Look where my horizon line is, right through the middle. But it works because I've got interest down here in the foreground as well as the sky. I've got stuff to balance the interest from top to the bottom. If that sky had been empty of clouds and sun, it would not have looked as good. But it's that sun that helps balance it out, which is why it works, okay? So again, generally try to avoid putting your focal point in that dead zone. So a common thing that people are taught is to aim for your focal point in one of these little intersections, okay? Right where those dots meet. Now, if you notice, here's my husband and my 3 daughters. This is during COVID. They're ultimately in that bottom left corner. And yes, my daughter's face is in that dreaded dead zone. But because they're clustered together and they're still overall right in that point, it works. Okay? Versus here, we've got my focal point is the hostas here with all the white snow in them. And notice there's really just nothing interesting in the middle, as I wanted to focus on the stems that had some snow on ice on them, as well as the leaves. This was from an April snow we had a few years ago. So, all right. Again, here's an example of where the dead zone just doesn't work. And it's not that this isn't a pretty cut photo with a couple, right? It's a fun little lovey couple thing. But by cropping it off and getting their faces, remember I said to get eyes at or above that upper third, by doing that, it makes it a stronger composition. Because I don't care about the background. I care about the people and what they're doing. So fill the frame, which is one of your rules here in a minute. So if we were to look at some photos I've already taken, these are old, like 2008, I think. All in Europe. So this was Prague, London, and Tunisia. And if you notice, the rule of thirds here is I've got this bright white window, which another thing is our eyes tend to want to look at the brighter areas in an image. So my eye immediately goes to this window, but it also sees this spiral staircase, and I want to go up that staircase. I want to see what's up there, right? And that's those leading lines, and then also notice the colors between the cool bottom and the warm tones on the top. So remember back from art days, warm tones are like your reds, oranges, and yellows. Think fire. Versus the cool tones being your blues, greens, and purples, like your sky and your grass. All right. Then here in the London, we got Tower Bridge. This is not London Bridge. This is Tower Bridge. We've got the horizon line pretty much on that lower third, with the tower portion being on the side. Whoops. Hi. And then we got these nice leading lines with the colors of the gables, or what, not gables, whatever they're called, supports of some sort. All right. And then we have this lovely image from Tunisia. And my eyes tend to go to this bright blue door framed in yellow. So remember, we're using that bright colors on this one, but we're also using a bunch of leading lines and lighting to guide us. But I see this pathway and this wall creating these shadow lines. So I've got these nice elements that drag me through to that door. Even though it's a center focused item, I'm using these lines to lead me to it. Okay. And it's still filling the frame. Okay. So which version looks better? These are some sheep that tended to wake us up in the Netherlands. They're really annoying, but hopefully you say the one on the right looks better, because those sheep are right in that dead zone. All right. They're right there in the middle. And notice I don't even care about this. I care about the sheep. So I'm going to photograph and capture them. This is actually a white sheep and a black sheep. Okay. Now, the rule of thirds can work with images focused in the center, but it depends on what elements you are using to get your focal point there. Get your viewer to look to those points. Okay. So here's my youngest daughter who just turned 9, and she is sitting in the couch and she's in the center of the frame. But you got the nice couch cushion lines and the textures and the lighting that say it's okay. I can see it's filling in the image of the scene. All right. Same thing with our lovely pier. I want to look in that white spot at the end of the pier to see what's out there. And it's those leading lines that are focusing. So there's a lot going on with the pier picture, but you still get the idea. And then the final one, you've got this lovely hanging bouquet thing on a stick, and I was able to capture the reflection of the water with the venue behind it. And so I've got the flowers and I've got this, and it's all kind of centered, but it's filling the frame, as well as using leading lines and colors to center it and make it work. Okay. All right. Second rule that we kind of want to know is balance. Now, there is a difference between balance and unbalanced. All right. And looking at these images, one should feel balanced and one should not. And I'm hoping you're saying the one on the right, this one, feels balanced. And the reasoning is you've got the simple wheel that doesn't exist here. You guys see that? So having a sense of balance isn't just about symmetry, although symmetry is a factor. Sometimes you might need something that stabilizes your image. In the one on the left, it looks like the girl could go flying down the thing and it could just like flop down and she goes sliding, right? Whereas the one where you see that second wheel stabilizes, it says, oh, she's okay. It's a calming feel. So it balances us, okay? So balance might also be a symmetrical thing. I've got this cool bridge with these nice little arches over them. This was back in St. Louis. But I don't care about all the background stuff. I care about the family here. So by cropping it off and using those arches to guide my eyes, it focuses me into the subject and adds some symmetrical balance to the image. And again, notice where the faces are once I crop it. All the faces are on those outer thirds. Obviously, he's not above that third. He's really close, but because there's a multiple of them, it works. It's okay. So it doesn't have to be perfectly on or at above or whatever on the thirds, but close. Okay. All right. So again, that lovely peer pictures. Can you tell it's one of my favorites? Um, it's got a nice sense of balance and symmetry. Remember symmetry. It's like if you were to put paint on one side and you smush it together and you open it back up, you'd have mirrored sides, right? Same kind of concept in photography. So it doesn't necessarily going to have to be exactly perfect, but it's the concept that it's similar. So like these doors at the plaza are similar, but if you notice the reflections in them, there's no symmetry there, but it's the shapes and the structures around it that make it work. Same thing with this. This is some building on the plaza too. And it would be fairly symmetrical if it weren't for this little bit of tree sticking out, but it still works. It still has a sense of balance. And it also helps that you can kind of tell where the ground is on these. All right. So it doesn't feel like some random thing floating in the air. It'd be kind of weird. All right. Anyhow. All right. So the next thing we want to talk about are mergers. And if you notice, we have the two-headed giraffe, and we've got the guy drinking with two straws and a tree coming out of his head. And then do you guys see the candlesticks coming out of the father's head? That was unintentional. I was a second shooter on this wedding, and he was just not at a good angle for me. And so one of the things as a wedding photographer is I'm constantly looking for things sticking out of people's heads if I can at all help it. I don't need the father to look like he's got horns coming up out of his head or the cross sticking out of the couple's heads, okay? So you got to pay attention to your background in addition to what you're photographing and make sure that the background alignment works. Because again, you don't need a two-headed giraffe or the tree coming out of somebody's head. And both of these would have been avoided if you would have just shifted your angle slightly. All right. So the other type of merger is a color merger. And if you notice, you got the girl here holding a volleyball with bright red, and it's blending in with the red on the umbrella. Same thing with the white even. Okay. So you want to make sure your colors aren't blending together. Now, trust me, in wedding photography, sometimes that can be really hard. Imagine a bride wearing a white dress on a snowy day, or a groom wearing a black suit or tux in a dark reception. All right, so it can get hard, but do your best to minimize that so that your subject stands apart from the background. Okay. All right, so we are getting into frames, which is something I kind of mentioned earlier. Frames can be man-made or they can be a natural frame. So obviously, if you're looking at the couple on the Tower of Kansas Bridge, this is off the River Market, we are using man-made frames. So it's these structures that kind of add a frame around people that say, look here, not at me, not at the frame, what's in my frame. Okay, it's kind of like a picture frame. Think about it that way. Maybe you want to use some trees or some natural leaves to create those frames for you. All right, notice they got leading lines here from the leaning tree at English Landing Park to the really long tree branch on the private property. All right, and maybe you're not really framing per se, but you kind of have this frames just by being a building, and you're using the lines inside of that building to create a unique frame. Okay. Horizons. Oh, okay. This is like the bane of my existence. I cannot stand crooked horizons. Okay. And in film, it's going to be a lot harder to get those straight, but it's not impossible. Okay. And I can show you tricks when we get to that point. But the idea is to look for the vertical lines that are going to be towards the center of your image. If you can get those up and down correctly, everything else should fall in place. And here's why I say this. Imagine you're standing on a 2-lane road and you're standing on the middle lines, right? Whether it's the solid line or the dashed line, that doesn't matter. You know that that road continues with the sides parallel to each other, meaning they don't go in or they don't go out, right? And if you yet you look down that road and it looks like it comes to a point, okay? But if you notice, if you're standing in the middle of that road, that center line is still in the middle. It is still straight, okay? So if you keep those vertical lines in the center straight, your overall perspective of the image will be accurate, or at least more so, okay? So here's an example. So this was several years ago, clearly, because my youngest here is now 9, and she's clearly not 9 in this picture and wearing diapers. I used the vertical lines of our deck railing to help get the horizon where it needed to be. But you don't want to use the outer ones, even though it works here. You don't typically want to use those outer ones because they might be kind of in or out. So imagine you're looking at a building, a tall building downtown, and you know that those sides are parallel to each other. You know, they don't go to a random point or they don't go flaring out like a tulip, okay? You know that they're parallel, but as you look up, they're going to look like they're going into a V, right? Or an upside down V. It's going to a point, right? So if you use those lines on the outer edge, those vertical lines in the middle, they're going to go like this, and it's not going to look right, okay? So always go for the middle lines to be straight, and everything else should fall in place, okay? Now, that's not to say you can't just go for it crazy, but it is not super common anymore. But if you're going to go for it, go for it. Make it a deliberate crank of the camera, get that angle, okay? So here's my oldest daughter who just is 13 practically, and a friend of hers who's only a few months older. Rather than going straight, I just I twisted it. I said, why not, right? All right. So even though you've got something like this, so this is my youngest and my middle, Maggie and Alex, and I use these vertical lines back here from the closet door. Okay. So you may not see where those lines are right away. Okay. And you can't always use the horizontal lines either, because if you're not straight on with a horizon, it may not work. So, for instance, if I'm using the edge of this pool here, this is on our old deck, because it's going slightly away from me, that horizontal line actually looks like it's going up. So if I try to use it to level, it would make everything crooked. So your only safe bet are those central vertical lines. Okay? All right. Next rule that's fun to play with is your vantage point. Now, it is so common for us to take pictures standing up as we are, as we see it. Okay? My challenge to you is to get down low. Look as though you're from an animal's perspective or a bug's perspective. Maybe stand up on a chair and look down. Get an aerial shot. Maybe you go up to the top of a building and look down. Find a different perspective. Stop looking just where you are standing. Squat down, look down, stand up, look up. Get down on the ground and look up. Change how you are seeing things, because I guarantee if you start changing your vantage point, you will start to see things differently. Okay? So, yeah, it's not to say I can't look straight out because this is a beautiful landscape, but look up for once in a while. Maybe go to the top of a building and look down. Look at your own damn feet. Where are you standing? Maybe get down to the water's level. Try not to get your camera wet. It might ruin it, so be careful. But maybe get up high and look out high. All right? Change it up so you're not looking in the same place every time. Okay? Fill the damn frame. All right. I cannot stress this enough. We get so focused on where our composition is that we worry about cutting something off. And it's okay. But fill the frame with the subject. So if we were to go back to that bride and groom that were kissing, that the groom picked her up, we don't care about the background so much. Get rid of it before you take the picture. If you have to get a little closer because your camera doesn't zoom in, get a little closer. Okay? Get your image in your frame rather than cropping out what doesn't work later. Okay? So, I'm using these lines here, but I'm focused on these little mushrooms in this tree log. Here's another photo from Key West. Okay? Here's my 3 daughters back in Plattsburgh. One of our Halloweens. All right? Yes, you're going to see a lot of photos of my daughters. Get over it. But fill the frame. I don't care as much about the background. Does it help to give them a sense? Yeah, you can tell where they are, but you don't need a ton of it. Okay? I've got the nice pylons from the Huntington Beach Pier. All right? And then I've got, yes, my tree is centered, but notice there's a lot going on from top to bottom, that even though the tree is vertically in the middle, there's a lot going on around it. If you notice, there's like a lot of fireflies and stuff right here, or little gnats, whatever they are. Okay, but there's plenty of stuff that's going on that keeps your interest throughout the image. But fill that frame. Okay? Cropping. All right. Cropping isn't so much of an issue with landscapes because if you base it off of your horizon line and what's in the scene, you should be pretty good. But when it comes to people, one of the worst things you can do is to crop at a joint. So like you're cropping at your elbow, or you crop at a wrist or fingers even. If it's a bending joint, don't crop off there, okay? You want to crop between the bends. So if you want to crop, you're going to crop mid-arm or mid-thigh or mid-calf, okay? You generally don't want to crop at things like ankles and elbows, all right? We're also, when we talk about cropping, we're also talking about how much of a body may be in the image, all right, if you're doing people. So if we're talking a 3/4, we're getting just below the waist up to the top of the head. If we're talking full, then we're getting all the way through the feet, right? That makes sense. We're getting a full body. Otherwise, we might be talking about a close shot, or a head shot, which is just, like basically what you guys are seeing in this lovely camera here. All right. So don't do like I did on accident and photograph and crop off my daughter's arms at her wrists. Okay. I know this one was one of those, oh, hey, you're coming at me, quick. All right. So don't judge too badly. But this is a good example of what not to do. All right. All right. So again, something else I mentioned before when we talked about the rule of thirds is space to look. And here's some more examples of what we're talking about. So it's not just about space to look, but it's also space to move. So I know a lot of you have dogs and you want to get photos of your dogs running around, right? Especially when we get to our motion portion. They need to have space to keep moving. So notice this is probably the only movement shot, right? And this is my daughter riding her bike. And she's on the right-hand side of the frame because you feel that she's coming at you and that she's going to turn to the left or her right. So you can feel this pathway coming through here, okay? You've got to give her space to move and to look. And notice even her eyes are over facing. So she's got more space in front of her than behind her. Same thing with this little girl peering over the flower girl basket, right? She's looking over this way, so we're giving more space on this side. Now, if you get something like this, it's kind of hard. They kind of do need to be centered because they're looking at each other, right? So, and then these two, they have more space on the side that they're looking towards than not, okay? And then finally, the last rule you need to know is learn them and then push the boundaries. All right. Learn the rules and then break them. Use the elements. Use the different things that you're learning to create awesome images. So, example, the bride and groom looking away from each other. There's no way to get a great space to look because they're looking opposite directions, right? So you have to give equal space on that. But it creates different perspective and unique lines, right? Um, so utilize those different tools that we've just gone through and have fun with it. All right. So I'm sure my guinea pigs Penny and Hazel are ready for some love from my daughter who just got home. So any other questions you have, please feel free to text me. I'm going to be faster at texting. It's not to say I can't respond to emails. I will say that I do struggle sometimes getting emails from you all, from your MCC email addresses. For whatever reason, the rules that I've set up to say deposit these into my, deliver them into my inbox, it still puts them in my junk. And I try to get my junk email checked, but I can't always guarantee I'm quick at it. You can try to message me through the Canvas inbox as well. And again, I might not be as quick on that as well. But I will answer your questions as soon as I can. For right now, just soak in all this information. I know it was a lot, but you got this. And hey, you got a cool video that you can refer to double check your information. So, all right. I hope you guys enjoyed this lecture. You learned a lot, and I hope you caught the few little fun tidbits of fun facts in my lecture to do on your quiz. Again, the quiz and the discussion group thing, which you don't need to respond to anybody else. You just need to add a post about what you learned. Those are going to be due by 1 o'clock today. So please get that done so you can get those attendance points. And I will see you next week. Have a great one.